The moment the lottery numbers flashed on the screen, my heart stopped. I stared at the ticket in my hand, the numbers aligning perfectly with the ones on the television. 6 numbers, each one a key to a fortune I never imagined I'd possess. $20 million. The amount was staggering, surreal, almost suffocating in its weight. I sat frozen on my couch, the world around me blurring as the reality sank in. I'd won. I'd actually won. But as the initial euphoria washed over me, a cold wave of fear followed. This kind of money changes everything: relationships, priorities, even who you are. I didn't want that. I didn't want my life to unravel because of a jackpot. So, I made a decision right then and there. I wouldn't tell a soul. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not even my family, at least, not yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to handle this without losing myself. The ticket went into a hidden compartment in my desk, and I swore to keep it secret until I could make sense of it all. But the weight of the secret was heavier than I expected. Every conversation felt like a minefield. Every glance from a stranger felt like they knew. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop thinking about what this money could mean. I needed help, but I couldn't just come out and say it. So, I decided to approach my family not with the truth, but with a carefully crafted story. I'd ask for their advice on a hypothetical windfall. A what-if scenario to gauge their reactions, to see who I could trust with this life-altering secret. It felt like the only way to move forward without exposing myself too soon. The plan was simple. I'd pose as someone seeking guidance, not someone who'd already won. But even as I planned, doubt gnawed at me. Would they see through me? Would they push for details I wasn't ready to give? I had to be careful, strategic, and above all, convincing. This was the beginning of a journey I wasn't sure I was ready for. The next morning, I called my older sister, Emma. She's always been the practical one, the one who'd balance her checkbook to the penny and plan her week down to the minute. If anyone could help me think through this without suspecting the truth, it was her. I drove to her house, my hands sweaty on the steering wheel, rehearsing my story. "Hey, Emma," I practiced in my head. "What would you do if you suddenly came into a lot of money?" It sounded casual enough, but my voice cracked when I tried saying it out loud. When I arrived, she was in her kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, her kids running around in the backyard. The normalcy of it all felt like a lifeline. I sat at her counter, sipping coffee, and eased into the conversation. "So, I was reading about this guy who won the lottery," I started, my heart pounding. "He didn't tell anyone, just kept it quiet. What do you think you'd do in his shoes?" Emma barely looked up from her soup, but I could see her mind working. She started talking about investments, about setting up trusts for her kids, about paying off her mortgage. It was exactly the kind of grounded advice I needed. But then she paused and looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you asking this, anyway?" she said, half laughing. I froze, my mind racing for a cover. "Just curious," I mumbled, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. I changed the subject quickly, asking about her kids, but the moment stuck with me. Emma was too sharp, too perceptive. If I wasn't careful, she'd figure it out. I left her house with a notebook, full of her practical suggestions, but also a growing sense of unease. This wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. Every word I said felt like it was tiptoeing around a landmine. I needed to refine my approach before I talked to anyone else. My next stop was my brother, Jake. He's the opposite of me: impulsive, a dreamer, always chasing the next big idea. If Emma was the voice of caution, Jake was the voice of possibility. I figured he'd have a wildly different take on what to do with a fortune, and I needed to hear all sides. I met him at a coffee shop downtown, a place he liked because it had good vibes. Jake was late, as usual, strolling in with his headphones on, and a grin that said he had nowhere better to be. I launched into my hypothetical scenario, keeping it vague but specific enough to get his thoughts. "Say you won millions, Jake. What's your move?" His eyes lit up immediately. He started talking about buying a yacht, traveling the world, starting a music festival. It was all big, flashy, and completely impractical. But that was Jake. He didn't ask why I was asking, which was a relief. But his ideas were so far from my reality that I started to question if I could even use his advice. Still, his enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment I let myself imagine what it would be like to live without restraint, to spend without fear. But then he said something that caught me off guard. "Man, if I had that kind of money, I'd tell everyone. Why hide it?" I felt a pang of guilt. Hiding it was my whole plan, but Jake's openness made me wonder if I was being paranoid. Was I overthinking this? Should I just tell them? I pushed the thought away and focused on his wild ideas, jotting them down to sort through later. As we parted ways, I realized I needed more than just advice. I needed to understand how this money would change the people around me, including Jake. My parents were next on my list. They're retired, living in a modest house they've had for decades, and they've always been frugal. If anyone would know how to handle money responsibly, it was them. But they're also the kind of people who notice everything, and I was terrified they'd see right through my story. I invited them over for dinner, figuring a familiar setting would keep things relaxed. Over lasagna, I brought up my hypothetical. Mom, Dad, what would you do if you suddenly got a ton of money? I asked, trying to sound casual. Mom laughed and said she'd finally take that trip to Italy she'd always dreamed of. Dad, ever the skeptic, said he'd put it in the bank and live off the interest. Their answers were predictable, comforting even, but then Mom got quiet. You're acting strange, she said, her eyes searching mine. Is something going on? My stomach dropped. I laughed it off, saying it was just a fun thought experiment, but I could tell she wasn't buying it. Dad chimed in, talking about how money ruins people, how it makes them greedy or lazy. His words hit hard. Was that what I was afraid of? Was that why I was keeping this secret? I left dinner with more questions than answers, my parents' voices echoing in my head. They'd given me solid advice, but their suspicion made me realize I needed to be even more careful. This secret was starting to feel like a burden I couldn't carry alone. As the days passed, the secret grew heavier. I started noticing how money, or the lack of it, shaped every conversation. Friends complained about bills, coworkers grumbled about rent, and I sat there, silent, knowing I could solve their problems with a fraction of my winnings. But I couldn't, not yet. I wasn't ready to let the world know, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. Instead, I kept seeking advice, refining my approach with each family member. My cousin Sarah was next. She's a financial advisor, so I figured she'd have the most practical take. I met her at a park, keeping it casual, and spun my story about a friend who'd come into money. Sarah didn't blink. She launched into a lecture about diversification, tax implications, and long-term planning. It was exactly what I needed, cold, hard numbers to ground me. But then she started asking questions about my friend. How much did they win? What's their financial situation? I dodged as best I could, but Sarah's analytical mind was relentless. By the time I left, I had pages of notes, but also a sinking feeling that I'd tipped my hand. She didn't outright say she suspected anything, but her parting comment, you can tell me anything, felt like a warning. I drove home, my mind racing. Was I being too cautious, or not cautious enough? The money was still locked away, untouched, but it was already changing how I saw the people around me. The more I talked to people, the more I realized how different everyone's priorities were. Emma wanted security, Jake wanted adventure, my parents wanted simplicity, and Sarah wanted control. It was like each conversation was a piece of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. I started to wonder what I wanted from this money. I hadn't even let myself dream about it yet, too afraid of what it might mean. But the conversations were forcing me to think about it. Did I want to quit my job, travel the world, buy a house? The possibilities were endless, and that was the problem. I needed a plan, but I couldn't make one without knowing who I could trust. So, I kept going, talking to more family members, each one adding a new layer to my confusion. My Uncle Mike, a small business owner, told me to invest in something tangible, like property or a company. My Aunt Lisa, a teacher, said to give back, to fund scholarships or charities. Each idea felt right in the moment, but when I sat down to think it through, nothing fit together. The money was starting to feel like a curse, not a blessing. I couldn't shake the feeling that telling someone anyone would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. But the secret was eating me alive, and I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. By now, I'd talked to half a dozen family members, and each conversation left me more conflicted. I started to notice patterns in how they reacted. Some, like Emma and Sarah, were suspicious, asking questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Others, like Jake and Lisa, took it at face value, spinning their own dreams without digging deeper. It made me wonder what I'd do when the time came to tell them the truth. Would they be happy for me? Jealous? Would they expect something from me? The thought of handing out money scared me as much as keeping it secret. I'd seen stories of lottery winners whose lives fell apart, family turning on them, friends demanding handouts, strangers showing up at their door. I didn't want that to be me. So, I kept up the charade, asking for advice while guarding my secret. But the more I talked, the more I felt like I was lying to the people I loved most. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about trust, about who I was becoming. I started to second-guess my decision to stay silent. Maybe Jake was right, maybe hiding it was pointless. But every time I thought about coming clean, fear stopped me. I needed more time, more clarity, more answers. One night I couldn't sleep. The ticket was still in my desk, untouched, but it felt like it was burning a hole through the wood. I got up and started researching lottery winners online, looking for guidance, for someone who'd done this right. The stories were a mixed bag. Some winners lived quietly, happily, while others lost everything. The common thread was that secrecy only worked for so long. Eventually, people found out. I started to wonder how I'd keep this hidden if I claimed the money. Taxes, bank accounts, lifestyle changes, they'd all leave a trail. I needed a plan, not just for the money, but for the life I wanted to live. I went back to my notes, reading through the advice I'd collected. Emma's caution, Jake's dreams, Sarah's numbers, my parents' warnings. It was all there, but it wasn't enough. I needed someone who could see the big picture, someone who could help me balance it all. That's when I thought of my grandfather. He's in his 80s, sharp as ever, and he's seen it all. If anyone could cut through the noise, it was him. I decided to visit him the next day, hoping he'd have the wisdom I was missing. Grandpa Joe lives in a small apartment, surrounded by books and old photos. He's the kind of person who listens more than he talks, but when he speaks, you listen. I went to see him, nervous but hopeful. I told him my hypothetical story, expecting him to see through it immediately. To my surprise, he didn't. He leaned back in his chair, thought for a moment, and then started talking about life, not money. Money doesn't change who you are, he said. It just makes it easier to be who you've always been. His words hit me like a ton of bricks. Who was I, really? Was I the kind of person who'd let this money define me? Grandpa didn't talk about investments or trips or yachts. He talked about family, about staying grounded, about using what you have to make a difference. It was the first time I felt like I could breathe since winning. I left his apartment with a new perspective, but also a new fear. What if I wasn't the person I thought I was? What if the money brought out something I didn't like? I needed to figure that out before I could move forward. The next week was a blur of research and reflection. I started looking into financial advisors, lawyers, tax experts, people who could help me claim the money without drawing attention. But every step felt like a commitment, a point of no return. I still hadn't told anyone, and the secret was starting to feel like a wall between me and the world. I stopped going out, stopped answering calls, stopped engaging with anyone who wasn't part of my plan. My family noticed. Emma called to check in, saying I seemed distant. Jake texted, asking why I was acting weird. Even Mom left a voicemail, her voice laced with worry. I wanted to tell them, to let them in, but I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I doubled down on my research, diving into the logistics of claiming a jackpot anonymously. Some states allowed it. Mine didn't. I'd have to move, maybe change my name, set up trusts, hire professionals. It was overwhelming, but it gave me a sense of control. I started to see a path forward, one where I could keep my life intact while using the money wisely. But the path was narrow, and one wrong step could ruin everything. I decided to test the waters with a small act of generosity. I sent Emma a check for $1,000, saying it was a bonus from work. I wanted to see how she'd react, how money, even a small amount, would change our dynamic. She called me the next day, thrilled but confused. "This is so generous," she said, "but are you sure you can afford it?" I laughed it off, saying it was no big deal, but inside, I was analyzing every word. She didn't seem greedy or entitled, just grateful. It gave me hope, but it also made me realize how much power the money gave me. I could change lives, but I could also create expectations, dependencies, even resentment. I started to think about how I'd handle larger sums, how I'd give without losing control. I went back to Sarah's advice, looking at trusts and charitable foundations. The idea of giving anonymously appealed to me. I could help without being in the spotlight, without changing how people saw me. but even that felt complicated. Who would I help? How much? The questions kept piling up, and the answers felt further away. By now, the secret was starting to affect my health. I was stressed, anxious, constantly looking over my shoulder. I'd stopped enjoying the things I used to love: movies, hikes, even simple dinners with friends. Everything felt tainted by the money I wasn't using. I knew I had to make a decision: claim it or let it go. But letting it go wasn't an option. This was my chance, maybe my only chance, to change my life and the lives of the people I cared about. I started drafting a plan, piecing together everything I'd learned: Emma's caution, Jake's dreams, Sarah's numbers, Grandpa's wisdom. It all had a place. I'd claim the money through a trust, keep my name out of it, and start small. Pay off my debts, help my family quietly, maybe fund a few local charities. The plan felt solid, but it also felt like a fantasy. The reality of claiming the money would be messier, harder, more public than I wanted. I needed one more push, one more perspective to make it real. That's when I thought of my best friend Tom. He's not family, but he's as close as it gets. If anyone could help me see this clearly, it was him. I met Tom at a bar, the kind of place where we'd spent countless nights talking about everything and nothing. I didn't want to tell him the truth, not yet, but I needed his take. I spun the same story I'd told everyone else, but with Tom, it felt different. He didn't jump to investments or trips or big plans. He just looked at me and said, if it was me, I'd make sure the people I love were okay. That's all that matters. It was so simple, so obvious, but it cut through all the noise. I realized I'd been so focused on protecting myself that I hadn't thought enough about what this money could do for others. Tom didn't ask questions, didn't push, just sipped his beer and moved on to talking about baseball. But his words stayed with me. I drove home that night with a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about MIT, it was about the people I cared about. I started to see the money not as a burden, but as a tool, a way to make things better, not just for me, but for everyone. The next day I called a lawyer. It was time to stop planning and start acting. I found someone who specialized in lottery winnings, someone who could help me claim the money anonymously or as close to it as possible. We met in a nondescript office, and I laid out my situation. Not the whole truth, not yet, but enough for her to give me a roadmap. She talked about trusts, tax strategies, and privacy laws. It was overwhelming, but it felt real. For the first time, I could see the money becoming part of my life, not just a secret in my desk. I left her office with a stack of paperwork and a sense of relief. I wasn't ready to tell my family yet, but I was ready to move forward. The lawyer warned me that claiming the money would change things. No matter how careful I was, people would notice, people would talk. I needed to be ready for that. I went home and looked at the ticket one last time before locking it away. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a promise, a challenge, a new chapter. A month later, I claimed the money. It wasn't as dramatic as I'd imagined. No flashing lights, no cameras, just a lot of paperwork and waiting. The trust was set up, the taxes were handled, and the money was mine. But I still hadn't told anyone. I started small, paying off my student loans, helping Emma with her mortgage, sending Jake some cash for his music festival dream. I did it quietly, through anonymous gifts or bonuses I made up. No one suspected, or if they did, they didn't say anything. I started to feel the weight lifting, not because the secret was gone, but because I was finally using the money. I set up a scholarship in my hometown, funded a local food bank, even sent my parents on that Italy trip Mom always wanted. Act felt like a step toward something better, something real. I'm still figuring it out, still learning how to balance the secret with the life I want to live. But for the first time since that night on my couch, I feel like I'm in control. The money isn't MIF's, just something I have. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.